You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Approaching area of heavy night fighter cover. Bomb aimer, start unloading your bundles of window. Going out window now.
Every trip, let's face it, you wouldn't be natural if you weren't scared stiff when you're being shot at all the time.
Bob Murphy enlisted in the RAAF less than a week after war broke out in 1939. After training in Canada to be a navigator, he joined an RAF squadron in England. No Australian squadrons had yet been formed. It was April 1941.
The very first memories of the squadron was they still had Manchesters, which was the forerunner to Lancasters. And there were some terrible results. I'll never forget the squadron coming back from a daylight attack on Brest. And there were a number of crashes on the aerodrome when the aircraft came back, and quite a few chaps killed. That was my really first experience of war, people being killed.
The horrible cost of war would only become more apparent to Bob, but he was one of the lucky ones. He survived. On his first tour, Bob flew 34 missions over Germany and occupied Europe, all in Lancaster bombers.
The Lancaster was the most efficient aircraft, aerodynamically very, very stable. It could be taken off with only 2 engines. It could just maintain height with 2 engines. It could stay in the air with 1 engine, but not maintain height. It was an exceptionally good aeroplane. There was good heating. It was a bit drafty and a bit noisy too, but it was you knew you were with a very, very good aircraft.
Of the 7,377 Lancasters built during the war, fewer than 20 survive. And I'm standing next to one, or rather under its huge bulk, here on display in Anzac Hall. It's the famous Avro Lancaster B1 G for George. So here we are, G for George.
Yep, remarkable aeroplane.
And with me is another George, George Bailey, the senior conservator who led the 5-year project to restore this much-loved aircraft.
You had guys flying these things who weren't old enough to have a driver's licence for a car. And you've got £500,000 worth of aeroplane and 6 other lives under your responsibility. And at the time, this was like a highly strung racehorse, prone to snapping tendons and things like that at any moment, because they were right on the edge of technology at the time.
G for George was assigned to 460 Squadron RAAF Bomber Command in October 1942. Over the next 18 months, it flew around 90 operations, more than any other aircraft in Bomber Command. Most were shot down before they'd reached 20. George carried a total of 27 crews, each comprising 7 men: pilot, navigator, wireless operator, bomb aimer, flight engineer, mid-upper gunner and rear gunner.
And it was considered a very lucky aeroplane. No, I don't think anybody got killed in this aeroplane, but a number of the people who flew in it got killed in other aircraft.
So G for George brought everyone home safely?
G for George brought everyone home safely, yes.
The major restoration of George didn't start until the late 1990s. After the aircraft was retired from combat service in 1944, it was flown out to Australia and around the country on a publicity tour, raising war bonds. For 10 years after that, it was left outside, deteriorating at RAAF Base Fairbairn in Canberra, before being transferred to the memorial.
They moved it into Aircraft Hall in 1955, and part of the RAAF's brief was to lighten it because of the floor loading, which Unfortunately, they did it in quite a brutal way.
You mean they had to take things off it?
They took things off it, so there were a lot of missing parts, which some of them taking off sympathetically, some of them literally hacked off and belted off with hammers. So the interior was pretty messy. It had been repainted in 1955 when it first went in, and then it got repainted again in 1970s by my cousin. And each time it got painted, the paintwork had shifted a bit away from what it originally looked like. So our brief was to bring it back to the way it would have looked in 1944 when it came out of squadron service and was refurbished to come out to Australia. So, yeah, we weren't sure on a few structural things because there are not many Lancasters this age around. We know that the Lancaster used by the Battle of Britain flight in the UK had corrosion problems in their wing spar and also some corrosion problems in their undercarriage legs. So we weren't quite sure what we were going to find, but those were our two key issues that we're looking at. And a further one was with this engine here, the engine mounts that hold the engine to the wing, two of them were quite badly cracked. We were quite concerned about those, and of course you can't buy spare parts. So we had to engineer a solution for that and get it signed off by engineers to make sure that we didn't have nearly a ton of aircraft engine falling on a visitor's head.
So at times you're making it up as you go along.
Yeah, quite often with this kind of work you're reinventing old skills because, like I said, parts aren't available for these things, obviously. They stopped making them a long time ago.
Were there any old manuals you could consult?
We did. We had a full set of manuals, which was good. Technical drawings, which we'd managed to get from the UK. So, yeah, we had those, but they're good up to a certain point. But as I've discovered working here in the last 30 years, despite what the blueprints say, every airplane is unique because in the heat of the moment, in the middle of a war, you make repairs to keep things flying, keep things going, and sometimes they're not done by the book. And we found a few instances of that in this aircraft.
Such as? On
top of the wings, there are stiffeners, and we think they're there because they had trouble with when you do a high-speed dive and pull out of it, you put a lot of stress in the airplane. And we believe that some of the buckles, some of the wings, the skin of the wings buckled a little bit during those manoeuvres. So this airplane has stiffeners riveted on the outside of the top of the wing. And we can tell that it was done at the squadron rather than in the factory because the way it goes over existing paint and stuff like that. Yeah, and little modifications all inside. Something's supposed to be here and we find it moved for whatever reason.
Did you find anything interesting in the cabin which told a little story about the men who flew in G for George?
There are signatures all through the airplane.
Signatures?
Signatures. So some of them are from aircrew that had flown in the airplane. They write their name on it and the date. But there's also a lot of signatures in there of civilians who got to have a ride in this when it was in Australia doing the war bonds tours, which some of those are quite fascinating, and we managed to track a couple of those down. One of the most interesting things was on one of the engine firewalls, and I can't remember which one was. Obviously, one of the aircraft mechanics was keeping an SP book, so horse races, and he's got a list of horses in this race and all the odds. And fortunately, with the internet, we actually managed to track down which race that was and which horse won. I can't remember the exact horse, but it's that human touch thing which we find fascinating when we look at these things, which is why we don't like to fully restore things, because if you fully restore something like that, you lose that personal connection.
You lose all the history.
Exactly, yeah. It's not groundbreaking history in that, but it's quirky history, and I think it's important history.
G for George is displayed with its undercarriage open so you can see the bombs on board, including a huge cylindrical device more than 2 metres long. Now, am I looking at the bomb over here, this huge canister that's dropping down from underneath the plane?
That's correct. Your standard Lancaster can carry up to about 18,000 pounds of bombs. Modified versions could carry 22,000 pounds. That bomb there is what we call a 4,000 pound cookie, and they're designed for area destruction, so mainly for destroying factories and things like that. In association of that, there would have been in this aircraft a pile of incendiaries. So the cookie goes down first, blows the roof off the factory, and then all the incendiaries drop inside it and just burn everything. But this could carry quite a range of bombs. You can see just around the side there, I think they're 250-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, sorry. And they would have been more for precision targets.
Did G for George ever suffer any damage on a mission?
quite a lot. A number of times it got damaged over Germany and that. Its biggest...
So hit by flak?
Hit by flak, hit by night fighters. There was one incident where they were attacked by a night fighter, and the night fighter got that close that they could read the squadron codes on the German fighter, which was also a G.
No way.
So whether the German pilots had seen the G on this and decided we're both Gs, we'll leave you alone, we're not sure. But yeah, it did suffer damage a number of times. The biggest damage it suffered was reasonably early in George's career. They were bombing up, getting ready for a raid, and one of these 4,000-pound cookies being loaded in another airplane 2 or 3 bays away, flew out of the airplane and went off and did quite a lot of damage to George on the rear right-hand side here. And it took them several months to patch it up. And through evidence in paintwork and things like that, we've discovered that they actually grafted part of another Lancaster into the tail. Sort of half of that tail is not George's original tail.
Such a conglomerate of different planes.
Yeah, but yeah, all in an effort to keep them flying. They recycled quite a lot of Lancaster things. They had actually had reclamation units, they called them, where, aircraft such as this would come back from a mission too badly to repair on the squadron, so they'd pull them apart and take them to the reclamation units, and they would reuse parts that were usable as a supplement to new production.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. The sound you're hearing is from a dramatic light and sound show that forms part of the G for George exhibit. It's called Striking by Night and recreates a bombing operation over Berlin in December 1943.
George, Roger. Beachbrook, George, we're in the funnel. Roger, George.
That night, Bomber Command lost 50 of the 500 bombers that took part in the raid, more than half in landing accidents caused by bad weather. Conservator George Bailey has spent a lot of time inside G for George. So what's it like in those cramped conditions?
For me, it's quite claustrophobic in there. I'm not a particularly big person, but it's a tight fit in there, and I can only imagine what it would have been like in a firing suit and oxygen mask and things like that. It would have been quite scary flying these things at night without being shot at, let alone,
Being shot at?
Being shot at, yeah. A lot of the pilots didn't escape these things when they went down, and that's something that the RAF addressed after the war.
It was hard for them to get out, you mean?
It was hard for them to get out because they would stay at the controls for as long as possible, allowing the rest of their crew to get out. And usually by the time it was time for them to get out, finding their way to an escape hatch was quite difficult in an aeroplane doing its own thing as it's crashing to the ground.
So there's no pilot ejector seat?
There's no ejector seats, no. There is an escape hatch through the roof, but it's quite difficult to get through. There's also one down on the front and one down the back. But if you can't get out the top, trying to get to either the ones on the floor would have been quite difficult.
Especially if the plane's on fire.
Exactly, and usually by that time the plane's almost uncontrollable. So as soon as he lets go of the controls, the plane, invariably twists one way or the other. So you're fighting G-forces and things like that. Yeah, it would have been quite a scary thing.
Usually, navigators such as Bob Murphy sat at a small desk behind the pilot. But in the early days of the war, as they were approaching the target, he'd climb down into the nose, guide the pilot over the target and physically release the bombs.
You're lying down on your stomach, looking through clear perspex, and it's rather frightening to see the flak come up at you. Rostock was my first actual bombing trip, and we went to bomb the Scharnhorst, I think it was, the big German battleship over there in Rostock, from 6,000 feet. And that was my first sight of flak. Lying down, the tracer bullets, or tracer shells, I think there was a tracer, one every 8 shells, and they used to curve up in an arc, and you would swear that they were going to hit you right between the eyes. and only about 2 or 3 feet in front of you. They either whiz over the top of your head or whiz to the left or to the right. They just missed. But you could swear every one of them was going to hit you right between the eyes. Most unnerving.
The casualties in Bomber Command were horrendous. Of the 125,000 mostly British and Commonwealth aircrew who served, 55,500 were killed. You were lucky if you survived your 30 operations. But despite this, some men, such as Bob, signed on for more. Towards the end of the war, he trained as a pilot and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Fear was existent the whole time. Often we would wake up in the morning with 3 officers sharing the one room in a mess, and it would be an exception, a rare exception, if the 3 of us were there when we woke up. Invariably there was at least 1 bed vacant after every trip. And you do that for about 4 or 5 years. As I've said before, someone must have been looking after you. It's amazing that the guys that did live through seem to be the ones that got out and relaxed, got a flight van if operations were scrubbed, put a few wafts into it and went out and had a party. Those who stayed at home in the mess, read books, wrote letters every night, for some reason or other, seemed to be the ones that got shot down early. Maybe just because I was a bit of a rascal and let my hair down. We went out with the crew, and at any opportunity like that, we lived through it. I can't explain it, but everybody was scared. There was nothing you could do about it. You were scared when you saw a fighter firing at you, and the searchlights come onto you, and the flak coming up at you. Mind you, we got hit several times. You're scared, all right, but there's nothing you can do about it. You just got to keep on going. You've got to keep going to the target. You can't just say, I've had enough of this and turn around and go back.
One of the many people Bob served with was Arthur Doubleday, a farmer from the Riverina who piloted a total of 53 operations. He was also awarded a DFC. Arthur is believed to have been the only Australian to command an RAF bomber squadron.
On my first tour, you're only looking after yourself and the crew. I was just a pilot officer. And whilst things move so damn quickly, you lose somebody or a couple of crews like that. Talking about that 1,000 raid on Cologne, then on Essen, and then the end of the in fact, the third night we went back to Essen as a squadron only, with only about 300 or 400 of us or something. But whilst that was a shocking time, suddenly you were launched forward into the next week doing something else, and 24 hours is a hell of a long time. So looking after ourselves just as an individual wasn't quite the same thing as later on. I can remember they used to leave the flare path on as they thought somebody might be coming back, and then they'd turn the bloody thing out. But it never struck me much about that, except when I got my own squadron, and they used to say, you'd have somebody missing. Well, do you want us to keep the flare path on? I used to say, yeah. I knew bloody well there were tons of flare path. But the moment I turned the flare path out, I had in fact said he's dead. So it did concern me, but I think on ops, I can remember things like Leipzig and Nuremberg where we lost 79, I think, and 96 and so forth. Well, these things were scattered. Well, there they were, burning on the ground, one about every 3 miles or 320 miles. And the crew was saying, they're going down here. I said, get your bloody eyes in the sky. There's nothing you can do with them. There's a quota tonight, and it's our job to keep out of it. And that was the attitude I took on ops. I mean, sorry, chaps, you're up here with us, but we can't help you. There's no platform between us. You've just got to fight it out. I don't know whether you get hurt in war or whether you just think more about things or something, but I'll admit, I didn't like losing a bloody crew. I didn't like to come and see the blank space on the door.
Edgar Pickles also started life on the land. As a pilot with Bomber Command, he flew 2 operational tours and was awarded a DFC by the King and later a bar. He met the Queen at the unveiling of the Bomber Command Memorial in England in 2012. In this 2018 oral history, Edgar recounts what happened in July 1943 when his Lancaster crew came under enemy attack on a bombing raid to Hamburg.
So I put the aeroplane into dive, and it's natural in an aeroplane to turn left all the time because all the circuits are left and your training is left and you're turning left. So I thought, well, I'll dive right at the end of this dive and this might get rid of him if he's still fighting, still chasing me. So I turned right at the end of the dive and we'd lost him. But in the meantime, he had killed the mid-upper gunner and the flight engineer who was shoveling this window out the flare chute. And he wounded the rear gunner. And we dropped the bombs on the way home. We didn't make any attempt to drop them on anything specific. If we'd dropped them over Germany, we thought we'd attract more fighters up to finish us off. And anyway, we pressed on, managed to avoid everything. We had no fuel gauges, of course, and no flight engineer, and we were doing our best to manage everything, but we're on 4 engines, and we got across the North Sea without any trouble and landed. Yes, that was a bad night, but if I hadn't dived, I think I wouldn't be here.
Continuous landing.
Most of the men and women who served in Bomber Command as air crew, ground crew, instructors and support staff are now gone. But G for George survives as a memorial to their courage, skill and sacrifice. Conservator George Bailey has strong connections. Not only did his RAAF cousin paint the aircraft, George's great-auntie May flew in G for George on one of its Australian publicity flights and left her signature inside. And there's more.
My father's cousin, Keith Finlay, flew in 460 Squadron, and for most of his tour he flew the G for George that replaced this one in 460 Squadron.
Wow. And he survived his tour of duty?
He did 32 missions and he survived.
32?
Yep.
So then what was it like for you to work on this aircraft, George?
At times quite emotional. I mean, I'd be sitting in there pulling something apart and you're just thinking about what it would have been like in there. And try as I might, I can't imagine how horrifying it must have been either on the ground being bombed by these things or in the air being shot at. It's a world away from me and something I'll never know. I hope I'll never know. It can be quite emotional when you stop and think about it, yeah.
But it must have been great when you finished to have George back to not the way it was when it was first built, because that's not what the job was about,
no.
But to have it in a state where people could come and understand the stories of the people who flew in this plane.
Yeah, certainly. I've done a number of projects at my time in the War Memorial, and this is the one I'm most proud of.
Why would you say that?
I got to meet a lot of veterans during the course of the work.
Including men who'd flown in G for George?
I never met anybody who flew in it, but I'd met other Lancaster pilots and ground crew and that. And the sense of appreciation that they gave to see their aircraft, even though they didn't fly in it, it's a Lancaster, so it's their aircraft. Seeing it looked after and appreciated, if you like, it can be quite touching, yeah. It really does make the job worthwhile, and it's the cream of the cake.
And the men were really close to their planes, weren't they? I mean, they had to be.
They had to be, yeah. And that's why they call them her. It's like a mother. The aircraft looks after them, brings them back. And I'm very proud of the work that we did in it, and it should be around long after I'm gone.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.